Hi, I'm Elisse. Last month, I sat at my sister's elegant dinner table, quietly listening as she bragged about her latest promotion to regional sales director. When the conversation turned to me, Jessica smirked and said, "Well, at least someone in the family is doing something meaningful with their life. Not everyone can afford to play bank teller forever." The entire table erupted in uncomfortable laughter. What they didn't know was that I had been secretly orchestrating the biggest acquisition in our local banking history. And when David Martinez walked through that door an hour later, everything changed. Have you ever been so underestimated that you started believing it yourself, until one moment proved everyone wrong and left them speechless? Keep watching, because what happened next made my sister's face go completely white, and she hasn't looked at me the same way since. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The crisp October air in Denver carried the scent of changing leaves as I walked down the familiar tree-lined street toward Mountain View Community Bank. The historic brick building stood proudly on the corner of Main and 3rd, its copper dome weathered to a beautiful green patina that caught the morning sunlight. I pulled my navy blazer tighter around my shoulders, not from the cold but from the weight of carrying secrets that felt heavier with each passing day. I had been working as a teller at Mountain View for nearly 4 years now, ever since graduating from the University of Colorado with my finance degree. To everyone around me, including my family, I was just another college graduate who couldn't land a real job in the competitive Denver market. The truth was far more complicated, but explaining it would require revealing things I wasn't ready to share. The bank's heavy wooden doors opened with their familiar creak as I stepped inside. The interior maintained its old-world charm with marble floors, brass fixtures, and teller windows that had served the Lakewood community for over 60 years. Mrs. Patterson was already waiting by my window, her weekly deposit envelope clutched in her arthritic hands. "Good morning, Elisse," she said with her warm smile. "How are you doing, dear?" I smiled back, genuinely fond of this woman who had become more than just a customer over the years. "I'm doing well, Mrs. Patterson. How's your grandson doing at college?" As we chatted about her family, I processed her deposit with the practiced efficiency that came from thousands of similar transactions. But my mind was elsewhere, thinking about the board meeting scheduled for later that afternoon. The meeting where months of careful planning would finally come to fruition. "Elisse," called David Martinez from across the lobby. As the bank's senior vice president and my closest ally in this institution, David was one of only 3 people who knew the complete truth about my situation. "Could I see you in my office when you have a moment?" I nodded, finishing with Mrs. Patterson before making my way across the polished marble floor. David's office was a study in understated elegance, with rich mahogany furniture and family photos that spoke of a man who valued relationships over status. At 45, he had worked his way up from a loan officer to senior management through integrity and genuine care for both customers and employees. "Close the door," he said softly as I entered. I did, then settled into the leather chair across from his desk. David leaned forward, his expression serious but excited. "The final paperwork came through this morning. The acquisition is complete. As of today, you officially own controlling interest in Mountain View Community Bank." The words hung in the air between us, surreal despite months of preparation. 4 years ago, I had started as a teller making barely above minimum wage. What my family didn't know was that I had also inherited a substantial trust fund from my late grandmother, Margaret Thornton, who had been one of Denver's most successful real estate investors. The inheritance came with strict conditions that I couldn't access the principal until I turned 28, which had happened just 6 months ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. For years, I had lived modestly on my teller salary, letting my family believe I was struggling financially. It was easier than explaining the complex web of legal restrictions and my grandmother's unusual requirements. She had wanted me to understand the value of money, to learn business from the ground up, and to prove myself capable before inheriting her legacy. "How does it feel to be a bank owner?" David asked with a grin. I shook my head, still processing the reality. "Surreal," Terrifying. Exciting. I paused, looking out the window at the busy street below. My sister is hosting a family dinner tonight. She's been particularly vocal lately about my lack of ambition. David's expression grew sympathetic. He had heard enough stories about my family dynamics to understand the complicated relationship I had with them, particularly with Jessica. Are you planning to tell them? I think it's time, I said, surprised by my own certainty. Jessica invited her new boyfriend, and apparently my parents are bringing Uncle Steve and Aunt Carol. She specifically mentioned that everyone is excited to hear about her promotion, and that maybe seeing her success would inspire me to do something more with my life. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. While Jessica had been climbing the corporate ladder at a pharmaceutical sales company, earning a decent but unremarkable salary, I had been quietly learning every aspect of banking from the ground up. I understood customer service, loan processing, investment strategies, and regulatory compliance in ways that most executives never would. Would you like me to come? David offered. As your business partner and friend, I think it might be appropriate for me to meet your family officially. I considered his suggestion. David had become more than just a colleague over the past 2 years. He had mentored me through complex financial decisions, helped me understand the intricacies of bank ownership, and supported my vision for modernizing Mountain View while preserving its community focus. His presence might provide the credibility my family would need to understand the magnitude of what I had accomplished. Actually, yes, I said. I think that would be perfect. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine transactions punctuated by moments of disbelief. Every time a customer addressed me as simply the teller, I felt the amusing disconnect between perception and reality. When lunch break arrived, I walked to the small park across the street and called my grandmother's former attorney, Richard Whitman. "Congratulations, Elisse," he said warmly when I reached him. "Margaret would be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. Not just the acquisition, but the way you've handled the entire process with maturity and discretion." Richard had been my grandmother's trusted advisor for over 30 years and had helped structure the inheritance in a way that would teach me responsibility while protecting the family wealth. He had watched me struggle with my family's dismissive attitude while being unable to reveal the truth due to legal constraints. She always said that true character is revealed not when people know you have money, but when they think you don't, I reflected. Wise woman, Richard agreed. And you've proven her faith in you was well placed. The way you've transformed that bank while learning the business from every level is exactly what she hoped you would do. After lunch, I returned to my teller window, but my thoughts kept drifting to the evening ahead. Jessica had always been the golden child in our family. 2 years older than me, she had excelled in school, been popular in high school, and landed a good job immediately after college. She had never struggled with self-doubt or financial uncertainty the way I had appeared to. The truth was more complex. Jessica's success, while real, was conventional and predictable. She followed established paths and met expected milestones. My journey had been deliberately unconventional, shaped by my grandmother's belief that true leadership required understanding business from the ground up. At 3 o'clock, I closed my teller window and made my way to the bank's conference room for the official board meeting. The acquisition had been structured carefully to maintain stability while allowing for strategic growth. I would serve as the majority owner and chairman of the board, while David would continue as president and chief operating officer. Together, we planned to expand Mountain View's digital services while strengthening its community ties. The meeting was brief but momentous. As I signed the final documents that transferred ownership, I thought about all the times my family had suggested I was wasting my education, that I should be more ambitious like Jessica. They measured success by job titles and salary figures, never understanding that I was building something much more substantial. By 5 o'clock, I was home in my modest apartment, choosing what to wear to Jessica's dinner. My living situation was another source of family concern. While Jessica lived in a stylish townhouse in Cherry Creek, I rented a small but comfortable place in Capitol Hill. What they didn't know was that I had chosen this apartment deliberately, wanting to live authentically on my teller salary, while my inheritance remained in trust. I selected a simple black dress and my grandmother's pearl necklace, the only piece of her jewelry I had kept. Everything else had been sold to help fund various community projects, another requirement of the inheritance that had taught me about philanthropy and social responsibility. David picked me up at 6:30, looking professional but approachable in a navy suit. We had decided he would introduce himself simply as a colleague and friend, unless the conversation naturally led to revealing more about our business relationship. "Nervous?" he asked as we drove through the familiar streets toward Jessica's house. "Strangely, no," I replied honestly. "I think I'm ready for them to know who I really am." Jessica lived in a beautiful 2-story house with a perfectly manicured lawn and expensive cars in the driveway. As we approached the front door, I could hear laughter and conversation from inside. My stomach tightened slightly, not from nervousness about the revelation, but from years of conditioning to expect dismissive comments about my choices. Jessica opened the door with her trademark bright smile, looking stunning in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her expression shifted slightly when she saw David beside me, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Elisse, you made it," she said, hugging me briefly. "And you brought a friend. Jessica, this is David Martinez. David, my sister Jessica." David extended his hand with a warm smile. "It's wonderful to meet you, Jessica. Elisse speaks of you often." As we entered the house, I could see my parents, Uncle Steve and Aunt Carol, gathered in the living room with Jessica's new boyfriend, a lawyer named Brad, whom she had been dating for 3 months. The introductions were polite, but I caught the subtle glances exchanged when David mentioned he worked with me at the bank. "Oh, you're a teller too?" my mother asked with barely concealed disappointment. "Actually, I'm in management," David replied diplomatically. Dinner was served in Jessica's formal dining room, the table set with china and crystal that spoke of her desire to impress. The conversation flowed easily at first, touching on local news, family updates, and Brad's work at his law firm. Jessica was clearly proud of her new relationship and took every opportunity to highlight Brad's accomplishments. "Brad just made partner at Morrison & Associates," she announced as the main course was served. "At only 32. Isn't that impressive?" The praise continued throughout the meal, with Jessica basking in reflected glory while subtly highlighting her own recent promotion. I listened politely, genuinely happy for her success, but increasingly aware of the growing divide between perception and reality. "So Elisse," Uncle Steve said during dessert, "Jessica tells us you're still working at that little community bank. Any plans to move up to something bigger? Maybe one of the major banks downtown?" The question hung in the air, loaded with assumptions about my supposed lack of ambition. I glanced at David, who gave me an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "Actually," I began carefully, "I'm quite happy where I am. Mountain View has a lot of potential." Jessica laughed, not unkindly, but with the patronizing tone I had grown to recognize. "Potential for what?" "Elisse, you've been there 4 years. At some point, you have to think about your future. I mean, what's the career path for a bank teller? You can't do that job forever." "Jessica's right," my father added, his voice gentle but concerned. "You have a good education, sweetheart. Maybe it's time to consider other opportunities. I could make some calls, see if any of my contacts in the financial district are hiring." The familiar weight of their well-meaning but misguided concern settled over me. For years, I had endured variations of this conversation, always deflecting or changing the subject rather than revealing the truth. Tonight felt different. "Actually," David interjected smoothly, "Elisse has been doing much more than traditional teller work. She's been involved in some significant projects at the bank." Brad leaned forward with interest. "What kind of projects?" I took a breath, feeling the moment approaching when everything would change. "Well, recently I've been working on an acquisition. A major one, actually." Jessica's eyebrows rose skeptically. "An acquisition? Honey, you're a teller. I don't think you understand what that word means in the business world." The condescension in her voice crystallized my resolve. I had spent 4 years proving myself, learning every aspect of banking and building something meaningful. I was done apologizing for choices that had led to extraordinary success. I understand exactly what it means, Jessica, I said quietly, especially since I just completed the acquisition of Mountain View Community Bank this morning. The silence that followed was absolute. Forks paused halfway to mouths, conversations died mid-sentence, and every eye at the table fixed on me with expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief. "What do you mean you completed an acquisition?" my mother asked slowly, as if the words didn't make sense in that order. David reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder, placing it on the table with quiet authority. "What Elisse is telling you is that as of this morning, she is the majority owner and chairman of the board of Mountain View Community Bank. The acquisition was finalized today after 18 months of planning and due diligence." Jessica's face had gone pale, her confident smile replaced by stunned confusion. "That's impossible. You work there as a teller. You make minimum wage." "I started as a teller," I corrected gently, "but I've never made minimum wage. And for the past 2 years, I've been learning every aspect of the banking business while preparing for this acquisition. What you all saw as lack of ambition was actually an education that no MBA program could have provided." Uncle Steve found his voice first. "How could you possibly afford to buy a bank? Do you have any idea what something like that costs?" This was the moment I had dreaded and anticipated for years. The moment when I would have to explain the inheritance, the trust fund, and most importantly why I had kept it secret for so long. "I inherited money from Grandma Margaret," I said simply. "A significant amount. But there were conditions attached to the inheritance that required me to prove myself capable of managing it responsibly." My father's eyes widened as understanding began to dawn. "Your grandmother was Margaret Thornton. I knew she was successful, but I had no idea." "She was worth several $1,000,000 when she died," I continued. "But she structured the inheritance so that I couldn't access the principal until I turned 28, and demonstrated that I understood business, finance, and the value of hard work. Working as a teller wasn't a failure to launch. It was preparation for this moment." Jessica's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. "You've been lying to us for 4 years?" "I've been living within the constraints of a legal trust," I replied firmly, "and learning skills that I needed to be successful. Every day at that bank taught me something about customer service, operations, regulations, or management. I couldn't learn those things in a corporate office downtown." David opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. "Mountain View Community Bank is now valued at $12 million. Under Elisse's ownership, we plan to expand our digital services while maintaining our community focus. She'll be overseeing a staff of 45 employees and assets totaling over $100 million. The numbers seemed to reverberate through the room. Brad, the lawyer, leaned forward to examine the documents, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement as he recognized their authenticity. "These are real," he said quietly. "This is all legitimate." Aunt Carol was the first to break the stunned silence. "Elisse, honey, why didn't you tell us? We've been worried about you for years." The question carried hurt and confusion, and I understood their feelings. From their perspective, I had allowed them to worry unnecessarily while secretly building wealth and success beyond their imaginations. "Because I needed to know that I could do it on my own," I explained. "Grandma Margaret understood that inheriting money without earning it creates entitled, ineffective people. She wanted me to prove that I could build something meaningful before giving me the resources to do it on a larger scale." I looked around the table at their faces, seeing the shock giving way to something else. Pride, perhaps, or at least a dawning recognition of what I had accomplished. "The bank was struggling," I continued. "They needed capital for modernization and expansion. I needed a business where I could apply everything I had learned. It was a perfect match." Jessica finally found her voice again, though it came out smaller than usual. "So when I was telling you that you needed to be more ambitious, you were talking to someone who was already planning the biggest business acquisition in Lakewood's recent history?" I finished gently. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was palpable. The patronizing concern that had colored family gatherings for years evaporated, replaced by something I wasn't entirely sure how to process. Respect, certainly, but also a kind of awe that felt almost as uncomfortable as the dismissal had been. "I owe you an apology," my father said heavily. "We all do. We saw what we expected to see instead of trusting that you knew what you were doing." David smiled, clearly enjoying the moment. "Elisse has been the most dedicated student of banking I've ever encountered. She insisted on working every position, understanding every process. Most bank owners have never processed a loan application or balanced a cash drawer. She can do both blindfolded." As the evening progressed, the conversation shifted dramatically. Instead of advice about my career prospects, I found myself fielding questions about business strategy, community banking, and expansion plans. Jessica, to her credit, began asking thoughtful questions about the acquisition process and expressing genuine admiration for what I had accomplished. "I feel like such an idiot," she said during a quiet moment when we stepped outside for air. "All those times I lectured you about ambition and success." "You weren't an idiot," I replied, meaning it. "You were a good sister who was concerned about someone she loved. I just wish I could have explained sooner." She hugged me tightly, and I felt years of misunderstanding beginning to dissolve. "I'm proud of you, Elisse. And I'm sorry for all the times I made you feel like you weren't enough." As David and I prepared to leave, my mother pulled me aside. "Your grandmother would be so proud," she said, tears in her eyes. "Not just of the business success, but of the woman you've become. The integrity you've shown, the way you've handled all of this." Driving home through the quiet Denver streets, I felt a profound sense of relief. The secret I had carried for so long was finally out, and rather than the complicated reactions I had feared, my family had responded with love and support. "How does it feel?" David asked as we pulled up to my apartment. "Liberating," I said without hesitation. "For the first time in years, I can just be myself completely." As I unlocked my apartment door, I realized that tomorrow would bring new challenges. Running a bank would require different skills than I had needed as a teller, and the responsibility for 45 jobs and millions in assets was sobering. But tonight, I felt ready for whatever came next. The girl who had started as a minimum wage teller to prove herself worthy of an inheritance had become a bank owner who understood her business from the ground up. More importantly, I had learned that sometimes the most profound success comes not from seeking others' approval, but from quietly building something meaningful while the world underestimates you. Sometimes the most powerful statement isn't what you say about your ambitions, but what you accomplish while others assume you have none. The next morning arrived with a crispness that felt like possibility itself. I woke in my small Capitol Hill apartment, sunlight streaming through the windows and casting warm patterns across the hardwood floors. For the first time in 4 years, I didn't have to carry the weight of a secret that had become increasingly heavy with each passing day. The relief was almost physical, like setting down luggage I hadn't realized was straining my shoulders. My phone had been buzzing intermittently since dawn with text messages from family members. Jessica had sent a long message around midnight, apologizing again and asking if we could have lunch soon to really talk. My mother had forwarded 3 job listings for executive positions, before apparently remembering that I already had one that surpassed anything she could find. Even Uncle Steve had sent a brief message saying he'd told his golf buddies about my acquisition, and they were all impressed. I made coffee in my small kitchen, using the French press that had been a college graduation gift from my grandmother. The ritual felt different now that the truth was out. Everything felt different, actually. The morning news played in the background, and when the business segment mentioned Mountain View Community Bank's recent acquisition, I found myself listening with new ears. They were talking about my bank, my decision, my future. David had scheduled our first official board meeting for 9 o'clock, followed by individual meetings with department heads throughout the morning. As the majority owner and chairman, I would be taking on responsibilities that went far beyond anything I had handled as a teller, even during my informal involvement in strategic planning over the past 2 years. I dressed carefully in a charcoal gray suit that I had purchased specifically for this transition. It was more expensive than anything in my previous wardrobe, but I had decided that presenting myself as a credible bank owner required investing in professional attire that matched my new role. The pearl necklace that had belonged to my grandmother completed the outfit, a tangible reminder of the woman whose wisdom and foresight had made this moment possible. The drive to the bank took me through neighborhoods I had come to know intimately over the past 4 years. As a teller, I had served customers from every part of Lakewood and had learned their stories, their struggles, and their dreams. Mrs. Rodriguez, who ran the corner market and deposited her modest weekly earnings with careful precision. The Johnson family, who had saved for 3 years to buy their first home and trusted Mountain View to help them navigate the mortgage process. These relationships weren't just customer interactions. They were the foundation of what made community banking meaningful. Mountain View Community Bank looked the same from the outside, but walking through those familiar doors felt monumental. Several employees were already at their desks, and I could sense a subtle shift in their attention as I passed. Word had spread quickly through the small staff about the ownership change, though I suspected most of them didn't fully understand what it meant yet. "Good morning, Elisse," called Maria Santos, our head loan officer. She had been with the bank for 12 years and commanded deep respect from both customers and colleagues. "Congratulations on everything. I hope you know how excited we all are about the future." I paused at her desk, appreciating her directness. Maria had always treated me as an equal despite my teller position, recognizing that I understood banking operations better than my job title suggested. "Thank you, Maria. I'm hoping we can meet this afternoon to discuss some ideas I have for expanding our small business loan program." Her eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "I'd love that. I've had some thoughts about streamlining our application process, especially for minority-owned businesses in the community." This was exactly the kind of conversation I had been looking forward to having openly. As a teller, I had observed inefficiencies and missed opportunities throughout the bank's operations, but I had needed to be careful about how and when I offered suggestions. Now I could engage directly with department heads about strategic improvements and growth initiatives. David was waiting in the conference room with coffee and a stack of documents that represented our first official board meeting. The room itself was modest but professional, with a polished oak table that could seat 8 people and windows overlooking the small parking lot where customers came and went throughout the day. "How are you feeling about all this?" he asked as I settled into the chair at the head of the table. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of us. 4 years ago, I wouldn't have been invited to sit in this room. Now I was leading the meeting. "Nervous," I admitted honestly, "but ready. I've been preparing for this moment longer than anyone realizes." We spent the next hour reviewing the bank's current financial position, outstanding loan portfolio, and operational challenges. The picture that emerged was largely positive, but highlighted areas where strategic investment could drive significant growth. Our customer retention rate was excellent, reflecting the personal relationships that defined community banking, but our digital services lagged behind larger institutions. "The technology gap is our biggest immediate challenge," David explained, pointing to comparative data he had compiled. "Our customers want online banking, mobile deposits, and digital payment options, but our current systems are outdated. The previous ownership couldn't afford the upgrades. I had been thinking about this exact issue for months. What would it cost to implement a comprehensive digital banking platform while maintaining our personal service model?" David consulted his notes. "Initial investment of about $200,000, plus ongoing monthly fees. The return on investment should be positive within 18 months, based on customer acquisition and retention projections." The numbers were significant, but manageable within our new financial framework. This was exactly the kind of strategic decision that the previous ownership structure had made impossible. "Let's move forward with vendor research. I want proposals from 3 different companies within 2 weeks." As our meeting continued, I felt the exhilaration of finally being able to implement ideas I had been developing for years. We discussed expanding our small business lending program, partnering with local real estate agents to capture more mortgage business, and creating financial literacy workshops for high school students in the district. Each initiative reflected my understanding of community banking's unique advantages. Unlike massive national banks that treated customers as account numbers, Mountain View could offer personalized service and deep local knowledge. We knew our customers' families, their businesses, and their financial goals. This personal approach was our competitive advantage, but it needed to be supported by modern technology and expanded services. The individual department meetings that followed were equally energizing. Sarah Chen, our operations manager, had detailed suggestions for improving loan processing times. Marcus Thompson, who managed our small but growing investment services division, presented ideas for retirement planning seminars that could attract new customers while providing genuine community value. What struck me most powerfully was how differently these conversations felt compared to the informal discussions I had participated in as a teller. Then, my suggestions had been welcomed, but treated as interesting input from someone without real authority. Now, when I expressed interest in an idea or approved a proposal, people understood that resources would be allocated and changes would be implemented. By lunchtime, my head was spinning with possibilities, and my notebook was filled with action items that would shape Mountain View's evolution over the coming months. David suggested we walk to the small cafe across the street for lunch, both to clear our heads and to be seen in the community as the bank's new leadership team. The lunch crowd at Rosemary's Cafe included several Mountain View customers who recognized us. Word had already begun spreading through the tight-knit Lakewood business community about the bank's acquisition, and I found myself fielding congratulations and questions from local entrepreneurs and longtime customers. "Elisse, honey," said Dorothy Walsh, who owned the flower shop next to the bank. "I heard the most interesting news about you this morning. Is it true you bought the bank?" The question was asked with such genuine warmth and curiosity that I couldn't help but smile. "It's true, Mrs. Walsh. I'm looking forward to working with everyone in the community to make Mountain View even better." She reached across from her table to squeeze my hand. "Your grandmother would be so proud, dear. She always said you had more sense than people gave you credit for." The mention of my grandmother created a moment of emotional connection that reminded me why community banking mattered. These weren't just financial transactions. They were relationships built over years of trust and mutual support. Mrs. Walsh had known my grandmother professionally and had watched me grow up through family visits to her flower shop. As David and I walked back to the bank, he mentioned something that had been weighing on his mind. "You know, there's going to be some attention from the media and the broader banking community about this acquisition. A 28-year-old woman taking ownership of a community bank is unusual enough to attract notice." I had been thinking about this possibility but hadn't fully considered its implications. What kind of attention? Business journals, probably some local news coverage. The Denver Business Journal will almost certainly want to do a feature story. There might be invitations to speak at banking conferences or small business events. The prospect was both exciting and intimidating. As a teller, I had been virtually invisible in the professional world. Becoming a public face for community banking would require skills I hadn't needed before and comfort with a level of visibility that felt foreign. "I suppose it comes with the territory," I said thoughtfully. "Though I'd rather be known for what we accomplish with the bank than for being young or unusual." David nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right attitude. Focus on results, and the rest will take care of itself." The afternoon brought a steady stream of routine banking operations that felt surreal in light of the morning's strategic discussions. I found myself observing familiar processes with new eyes, seeing opportunities for improvement that I could now actually implement. When Mrs. Patterson came in for her weekly deposit, our interaction carried additional meaning. She wasn't just a valued customer. She was part of the community I was now responsible for serving at the highest level. Around 3 o'clock, my personal phone rang with a call from Jessica. I stepped into David's office to take it privately, curious about what had prompted her to call during business hours. "Elisse, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," she began, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that was completely unlike her usual confident tone. "Not at all. What's going on?" "I wanted to apologize again for last night, but also to ask you something that's been bothering me since I woke up this morning." She paused, and I could hear her taking a breath. "How many times did I make you feel bad about your choices? How often did I say things that must have hurt when you knew you were actually building something incredible?" The question caught me off guard with its directness and obvious emotional weight. Jessica wasn't typically given to introspection about interpersonal dynamics, and her genuine distress was audible. "Jessica, you don't need to torture yourself about this. You were being a concerned sister based on the information you had." "But that's just it," she continued. "I wasn't really listening to you, was I? I was so convinced that I knew what success looked like that I never considered you might have a completely different plan that was actually working. Her insight was accurate and painful. There had been countless moments over the past 4 years when her well-meaning but condescending advice had stung precisely because I couldn't explain why it was unnecessary. Family gatherings, where she had suggested job opportunities, or questioned my financial decisions while I was secretly managing an investment portfolio worth millions. There were times it was hard, I admitted. Especially when you'd talk about my lack of ambition in front of other people. But I also understood why you were concerned. From the outside, it probably did look like I was stuck. "I feel like I owe you more than an apology," she said quietly. "I feel like I owe you respect that I should have been giving you all along. The way you handled everything last night, the grace you showed when you could have made us all feel terrible about our assumptions, that says something about who you are as a person." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Jessica asking thoughtful questions about my plans for the bank and expressing genuine admiration for what I had accomplished. When we hung up, I felt a shift in our relationship that went beyond simply revealing my secret. For the first time, Jessica was treating me as an equal rather than a younger sister who needed guidance. The remainder of the afternoon passed quickly, filled with operational details and planning discussions. As closing time approached, I realized I would need to establish new routines and boundaries around my work schedule. As a teller, I had punched a time clock and left my responsibilities at the bank when I went home. As an owner, the line between personal and professional time would be much less clear. David knocked on my door as I was gathering my things. "Before you go, there's something else we should discuss. The previous owner left behind some personal items in the executive office upstairs. It's yours now, whenever you're ready to claim it." I had forgotten about the executive office. For 4 years, it had been occupied by Harold Martinez, David's uncle and the bank's previous owner. Harold had been forced to sell due to health issues, and his children's lack of interest in continuing the family business. The office itself was larger than my entire apartment, with windows overlooking Main Street and furnishings that spoke of decades in community banking. "Would you like to see it now?" David asked. We climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, which housed the executive office, a small conference room, and storage space for bank records. The executive office door was solid oak with a brass nameplate that still read, "Harold Martinez, President." David produced a key and unlocked the door, stepping aside to let me enter first. The office was everything I had imagined and nothing I had expected. The furniture was substantial and well-made, but clearly from another era. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, flanked by leather chairs that had seen decades of use. Built-in bookcases lined one wall, filled with banking regulations, local history books, and family photographs that Harold had apparently forgotten to take with him. What struck me most was the view. From the large windows, I could see almost the entire downtown Lakewood area. The hardware store where my father had taken me to buy my first toolbox. The library, where I had spent countless hours studying for my finance degree. The park where I had walked during lunch breaks, thinking about the future I was secretly building. "It needs updating," David said, noting my examination of the space. Harold's decorating style hadn't changed since the 1980s. But the bones are good, and the location is perfect for staying connected to the community. I walked around the desk and sat in the executive chair, feeling the weight of history and responsibility. This office had been the center of financial decision-making for Lakewood for over 30 years. From this desk, Harold had approved mortgages that allowed families to buy their first homes, small business loans that launched local entrepreneurs, and educational loans that sent neighborhood kids to college. "Tomorrow," I said, looking around the space with new eyes. "I'll move in tomorrow. It's time to make this transition official in every way." As we locked the office and headed downstairs, I reflected on how much had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday, I had been a teller with a secret. Today, I was a bank owner with a community to serve and a business to grow. The transformation felt both gradual, given years of preparation, and sudden, given the dramatic shift in public perception and official responsibility. The drive home took me through residential neighborhoods, where many of our customers lived. I found myself looking at houses differently. wondering about mortgage balances and refinancing opportunities, thinking about how Mountain View could better serve these families' financial needs. The mental shift from employee to owner was happening faster than I had anticipated. My apartment felt smaller when I returned, not physically but psychologically. The modest space that had perfectly suited a bank teller saving money and living quietly no longer matched my professional reality. I made a mental note to start looking for something more appropriate to my new circumstances, perhaps a small house with a home office where I could work in the evenings. I called my parents to check in, knowing they were probably still processing the previous evening's revelations. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice warm but still carrying notes of amazement. "Elisse, honey, how was your first day as a bank owner?" The phrase sounded surreal, even coming from my own mother. Educational. Exciting. A little overwhelming. I had no idea how many decisions would need to be made immediately. "Your father and I have been talking about last night," she said. "We're still trying to wrap our heads around everything, but we want you to know how proud we are. Not just of the business success, but of the maturity and integrity you've shown throughout this whole process." We talked for nearly an hour, with my parents asking detailed questions about my plans for the bank and sharing their own insights from years of small business experience. My father, who had always been somewhat distant in his pride, expressed genuine admiration for the strategic thinking that had guided my approach to the acquisition. As evening settled over Denver, I sat by my apartment window with a cup of tea, watching the city lights begin to twinkle across the metropolitan area. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight I felt a profound sense of accomplishment and possibility. The young woman who had walked into Mountain View Community Bank 4 years ago as a temporary employee had become its owner through patience, determination, and careful planning. But more than that, I had proven to myself and my family that success doesn't always follow conventional timelines or traditional paths. Sometimes the most meaningful achievements happen quietly, built day by day through consistent effort and unwavering vision, until suddenly the world notices what you've been creating all along. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't in proving others wrong, but in staying true to your own sense of purpose, regardless of their expectations. 3 weeks into my new role as bank owner, I was discovering that success brought its own unexpected complications. The Denver Business Journal had indeed reached out for an interview, which was scheduled for Friday afternoon. 2 different banking conferences had invited me to speak on panels about community banking innovation. Most surprisingly, 3 other small banks in Colorado had contacted David about potential consulting arrangements to help them modernize their operations. The attention was flattering but also overwhelming. I had spent 4 years learning to be invisible, blending into the background while I absorbed knowledge and built capabilities. Suddenly being thrust into a spotlight felt like learning to walk all over again, except with everyone watching and forming opinions about my every step. This particular morning brought a challenge I hadn't anticipated. Rebecca Winters, a reporter from the Business Journal, was coming in at 10 o'clock to tour the bank and conduct her interview. I had spent the previous evening rehearsing potential questions with David, but I still felt nervous about representing not just myself but the entire community banking industry. I arrived at the bank early, wanting to ensure everything looked professional and welcoming. The morning routine that had once been automatic now felt laden with significance. Every interaction with customers, every operational decision, every conversation with staff members carried the weight of ownership and public scrutiny. Maria Santos approached my desk with a smile that didn't quite hide her concern. "Elisse, we need to talk about the Morrison account. They're 3 months behind on their business loan, and I'm not sure what our options are." The Morrison family owned a small restaurant that had been struggling since the economy shifted. Their loan was for $60,000, significant for a bank our size, but not catastrophic. However, the decision about how to handle their situation would test my philosophy about community banking and establish precedents for future difficult cases. "Let's review their file," I said, following Maria to her office. The paperwork told a story I had seen repeated throughout Lakewood over the past few months. A small business that had thrived for years was now caught between rising costs and changing consumer habits. The Morrisons weren't irresponsible borrowers. They were hard-working people facing circumstances beyond their control. "What would you recommend?" I asked Maria, genuinely curious about her perspective. She had handled difficult loan situations for over a decade and understood both the business realities and the human costs involved. Traditionally, we'd be looking at foreclosure proceedings, she said carefully. But I know Tom Morrison personally. His daughter goes to school with my son. They're good people who just need time to adapt their business model. This was exactly the kind of decision that separated community banking from corporate finance. A large bank would have algorithms and protocols that removed human judgment from the equation. We had the luxury and responsibility of considering individual circumstances and long-term community relationships. What if we restructured the loan? I suggested. Lower monthly payments, extended term, maybe even a temporary interest reduction while they implement changes to their restaurant model? Maria's face brightened with relief and approval. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Tom has some great ideas about adding catering services and updating their menu. He just needs breathing room to implement them. We spent the next hour crafting a loan modification proposal that would give the Morrison family 6 months of reduced payments followed by a gradual return to full payments over an extended timeline. The restructuring would cost the bank some interest income in the short term, but it preserved a long-term relationship and kept a local business operating. As we finished the paperwork, I realized this decision perfectly illustrated why I had wanted to own a community bank rather than simply work for a large institution. The ability to make decisions based on relationships and long-term community health, rather than purely financial metrics, was exactly what made this work meaningful. Rebecca Winters arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a professional demeanor that immediately put me on alert. Business reporters weren't known for asking softball questions, and I could sense her evaluating everything from my appearance to the bank's decor as potential story elements. "Miss Thompson," she said, extending her hand with a firm grip, "thank you for agreeing to this interview. I have to say, your story has generated quite a bit of interest in the business community." David joined us for the initial tour, explaining the bank's history and current operations, while I tried to read Rebecca's reactions to what she was seeing. She asked detailed questions about our customer demographics, loan portfolio, and technology systems, taking notes in a small leather notebook that never seemed to leave her hand. "I understand you worked as a teller here for 4 years before the acquisition," she said as we settled in the small conference room for the formal interview. "That's highly unusual. Most bank acquisitions involve outside investors or corporate buyers." The question contained an implicit challenge about my qualifications and experience. I had prepared for this line of inquiry, but actually facing it felt more intimidating than I had expected. "I believe the hands-on experience gave me insights that traditional banking education might not provide," I replied carefully. "I understand our operations from the ground up, and I have relationships with customers that span years rather than months. But surely there's a difference between processing transactions and making strategic decisions that affect millions of dollars in assets," she pressed. David intervened smoothly. "Actually, Elisse has been involved in strategic planning for the past 2 years. The acquisition was the culmination of extensive preparation, not an impulse purchase." Rebecca's questions continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from my educational background to my plans for expansion. Some questions felt designed to test my knowledge of banking regulations and industry trends. Others seemed aimed at uncovering potential weaknesses or inconsistencies in my story. "What do you say to critics who might suggest that a 28-year-old with limited executive experience isn't qualified to run a bank?" she asked bluntly. The question stung, partly because it echoed doubts I sometimes had about myself during particularly challenging days. But it also crystallized my understanding of what I was really doing at Mountain View. "I'd say that qualification isn't just about age or traditional experience," I replied, feeling my confidence strengthen as I spoke. "It's about understanding your customers, your community, and your industry. It's about making decisions that create long-term value rather than short-term profits. And it's about having the humility to surround yourself with experienced people who can guide you through challenges." Rebecca nodded, making another note. "Speaking of challenges, how do you plan to compete with larger banks that have significantly more resources for technology and marketing?" This question excited me because it addressed what I saw as community banking's core advantage. We're not trying to compete with large banks on their terms. We're offering something they can't provide: personalized service, local decision-making, and genuine investment in community success. Our customers aren't account numbers, they're neighbors. The interview concluded with Rebecca asking about my personal background and the inheritance that had made the acquisition possible. I explained my grandmother's influence and the structure of the trust fund, emphasizing the years of preparation and learning that had preceded my access to the necessary capital. After Rebecca left, I felt drained but cautiously optimistic about how the interview had gone. David seemed pleased with my responses, though he warned that business reporters sometimes had different interpretations of conversations than their subjects expected. The afternoon brought a pleasant surprise in the form of an unscheduled visit from Jessica. She arrived just as I was finishing lunch, looking professional in a navy suit, but also nervous in a way that was completely unlike her usual confident demeanor. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," she said, glancing around the bank lobby with obvious curiosity. "I was in the neighborhood for a client meeting and thought I'd see your workplace officially." I gave her a quick tour, introducing her to staff members and explaining some of the improvements we were planning. Jessica asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely impressed by the bank's community focus and the staff's obvious respect for both David and me. "This is incredible, Elisse," she said as we settled in my temporary office space. "I mean, I heard you talking about it the other night, but seeing it in person makes it more real somehow." We talked for nearly an hour about the bank, my plans for expansion, and the unexpected challenges of suddenly being a public figure in the local business community. Jessica shared insights from her own experience with professional visibility and offered advice about managing media attention. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation yesterday," she said as she prepared to leave. "Not just about the apologies I owe you, but about what I can learn from how you approached this whole situation." Her comment surprised me. Jessica had always been successful by conventional measures, and I hadn't expected her to see my unconventional path as something worth emulating. "What do you mean? You had a plan that nobody else could see, and you stuck with it even when people questioned your choices," she explained. "I've always followed more obvious paths, doing what was expected and measuring success by external validation. Watching you reveal what you'd been building in secret made me realize I might be playing a smaller game than I'm capable of." This perspective shift in Jessica felt as significant as the business success I had achieved. For years, our relationship had been defined by her assumption that she was the more successful sibling. Now she was recognizing that success could take forms she hadn't previously considered. The rest of the week passed in a blur of operational decisions, strategic planning meetings, and continued adjustment to my new public profile. The loan restructuring for the Morrison family was approved and signed, providing both immediate relief for them and personal satisfaction for me. Small victories like this reminded me why I had wanted to own a community bank rather than simply invest in financial markets. Friday afternoon brought the culmination of a week of technological advancement planning. 3 different vendors had presented proposals for upgrading our digital banking platform, and David and I spent several hours evaluating the options. The decision would represent the largest single investment in the bank's modernization and would significantly impact our competitive position. "The middle option gives us the best balance of functionality and cost," David concluded after reviewing all 3 presentations. "It positions us competitively with larger banks while maintaining the personal service that defines our brand." I agreed with his analysis, but the financial commitment still felt substantial. $200,000 represented a significant portion of our available capital for improvements, and the decision would affect the bank's financial flexibility for the next several years. "Let's move forward with it," I decided, signing the authorization paperwork. Our customers deserve modern banking services, and this investment should pay for itself within 18 months. As I signed the documents, I reflected on how different this decision-making process felt compared to my days as a teller. Then, technology upgrades were distant possibilities discussed by management in meetings I wasn't invited to attend. Now, I was authorizing expenditures that would shape the bank's future and directly impact every customer interaction. The week concluded with an unexpected phone call from David Martinez, the bank's previous owner. He had been following news of the acquisition and wanted to congratulate me personally on the smooth transition and early operational improvements. "I've been hearing good things about the changes you're implementing," he said warmly. "David tells me you're planning to modernize the technology systems while maintaining our community focus." That's exactly what the bank needed. Harold's approval meant more to me than I had expected. He had built Mountain View Community Bank into a respected local institution over 30 years, and his endorsement validated my approach to ownership and management. "I hope you know that selling to you was the best decision I could have made for the bank's future," he continued. "You understand what community banking is really about, in a way that corporate buyers never would have." The conversation reminded me that I was not just running a business, but continuing a legacy of community service that stretched back decades. The responsibility felt heavier, but also more meaningful than purely financial success. That evening, I met my parents for dinner at a quiet restaurant in downtown Denver. The venue was my mother's choice, upscale enough to feel like a celebration but intimate enough for genuine conversation. The dynamic between us had shifted dramatically since the revelation of my bank ownership, but we were still navigating what our new relationship would look like. "We saw the announcement in the business journal about your technology upgrade," my father said as we reviewed the menu. "It sounds like a significant investment." The comment reflected his growing understanding of my business responsibilities and his desire to engage with my work in a more meaningful way. For years, our conversations had focused on his architectural projects, while my job was dismissed as temporary or insignificant. Now he was treating my decisions as worthy of serious discussion. "It's necessary for staying competitive," I explained. "Our customers want digital banking options, but they also want the personal service that larger banks can't provide. The technology upgrade lets us offer both." My mother asked thoughtful questions about the challenges of modernizing while maintaining community relationships, demonstrating that she had been researching community banking since learning about my acquisition. Her genuine interest in understanding my work felt like a gift I hadn't realized I wanted. "I've been thinking about what you said the other night," she said as our entrees arrived, "about your grandmother's influence and the structure of your inheritance. I never fully understood what Margaret was trying to teach you, but seeing what you've accomplished makes her wisdom obvious." The mention of my grandmother brought a familiar mixture of gratitude and sadness. Margaret Thornton had died during my junior year of college, before she could see the results of her careful planning and guidance. I often wondered what she would think of the decisions I was making and the direction I was taking her legacy. She always said that money without understanding was dangerous, I reflected. The trust fund structure forced me to learn business from the ground up rather than starting at the top with inherited wealth. My father nodded thoughtfully. "Smart woman. I've seen too many second-generation business owners fail because they inherited responsibility without earning the knowledge to handle it properly." The conversation continued through dessert and coffee, covering topics that ranged from bank operations to family history to my grandmother's broader influence on our family's approach to business and community involvement. For the first time in years, I felt completely comfortable discussing my work and ambitions with my parents. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, my mother pulled me aside for a private moment. "I want you to know how sorry I am for not supporting you more over the past few years," she said quietly. "I was so focused on conventional definitions of success that I completely missed what you were actually accomplishing." Her apology felt genuine and healing, addressing years of subtle disappointment and concern that had colored our relationship. But more than that, it represented a fundamental shift in how she understood success and achievement. "You raised me to be independent and thoughtful," I replied. "Everything I've accomplished builds on the foundation you and Dad provided." The drive home through Denver's Friday evening traffic gave me time to process the week's events and prepare mentally for the challenges ahead. The Business Journal article would be published next week, potentially bringing additional attention and scrutiny. The technology upgrade would require careful implementation to avoid disrupting daily operations. Several new loan applications needed review, and the small business financial literacy workshop I was planning required significant preparation. But underlying all these practical considerations was a deeper satisfaction with the path I had chosen and the progress I was making. The bank was thriving under our new ownership structure, the community was responding positively to our modernization efforts, and my family relationships had been transformed by honest communication and mutual respect. As I parked outside my apartment building, I realized that the most significant change over the past month wasn't the public recognition or the business responsibilities. It was the quiet confidence that came from finally being able to live authentically, without secrets or pretense. The young woman who had carefully hidden her capabilities and resources for 4 years had become someone who could make decisions, lead teams, and build something meaningful in full view of her community and family. The transformation felt complete, not because the work was finished, but because I was finally free to pursue my vision without constantly managing others' perceptions and expectations. Sometimes the greatest freedom comes not from achieving your goals, but from no longer needing to hide the fact that you're pursuing them. And sometimes the most powerful moment isn't when others finally see your success, but when you finally stop caring whether they do. The Denver Business Journal article hit newsstands on a crisp Monday morning in November, and by 9 o'clock my phone was ringing constantly. The headline read, "The Quiet Revolution: How a 28-year-old Transformed from Bank Teller to Owner," accompanied by a photograph of me standing in front of Mountain View's historic facade, looking more confident than I felt during the actual photo session. Rebecca Winters had crafted a story that was both flattering and fair, highlighting my unconventional path while acknowledging the legitimate questions about my experience and qualifications. She had captured the essence of community banking and positioned my acquisition as part of a broader trend toward local ownership and personalized financial services. The immediate response was overwhelming. 3 potential investors called before lunch, interested in partnering on expansion opportunities. A community college in Aurora reached out about having me speak to their business students. Most surprisingly, 2 other young entrepreneurs contacted David asking for advice about acquiring small businesses in their own communities. But it was the local response that mattered most to me. Throughout the morning, a steady stream of customers stopped by to congratulate me and express their support for the bank's direction. Mrs. Patterson brought homemade cookies for the staff. The owner of the hardware store across the street presented me with a small potted plant for my office. These gestures of community support meant more than any business accolades could have. Around noon, Jessica called with excitement, bubbling in her voice. "Elisse, I just saw 3 of my coworkers reading your article in the break room. They were all talking about how impressive your story is. I may have mentioned that you're my little sister." The pride in her voice was unmistakable and represented a complete reversal from the dismissive concern she had expressed just weeks earlier. This transformation in our relationship had become one of the unexpected benefits of revealing my true circumstances. "I hope the attention doesn't become too much," I admitted. "I'm still learning how to balance the public aspects of ownership with actually running the bank." "You'll figure it out," Jessica said with newfound confidence in my abilities. "You've managed everything else perfectly so far." The afternoon brought a surprise visit from Tom Morrison, whose family restaurant we had helped with the loan restructuring. He arrived carrying a large basket covered with a checkered cloth, looking nervous but determined to express his gratitude personally. "Ms. Thompson," he said, setting the basket on my desk, "my wife insisted I bring you some of our signature items from the restaurant. We want you to know how much the loan modification means to our family." Inside the basket were containers of the restaurant's famous chili, fresh-baked bread, and homemade pie that looked absolutely delicious. But more than the food, Tom's visit represented validation of the community-centered approach I was trying to implement at Mountain View. "The payment reduction gives us breathing room to implement the catering services we've been planning," he continued. "We've already booked 3 events for next month, and the additional revenue should help us get back on track quickly." This was exactly the outcome I had hoped for when we restructured their loan. Instead of forcing a foreclosure that would have hurt both the Morrison family and the community, we had provided space for them to adapt and grow. The decision reinforced my belief that community banking could balance financial responsibility with human compassion. David appeared in my doorway as Tom was leaving, carrying a folder that looked suspiciously thick with important documents. His expression suggested a mixture of excitement and concern that immediately caught my attention. "We need to talk," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. I've been fielding calls all morning from banks across Colorado. 3 different institutions want to discuss acquisition opportunities with us. The news was simultaneously flattering and alarming. We had been successful bank owners for less than 2 months, and already other institutions were seeing us as potential partners or targets for expansion. The attention suggested we were doing something right, but it also introduced complications I hadn't anticipated. "What kind of opportunities?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. 2 smaller banks in rural communities are interested in selling to us. They're facing the same challenges that Mountain View faced before the acquisition: limited capital for modernization and difficulty competing with larger institutions. David opened the folder and spread out financial summaries for both institutions. The third call was different. First National wants to buy us. First National was one of Colorado's largest regional banks, with branches throughout the Denver metropolitan area and assets exceeding $2 billion. Their interest in acquiring Mountain View was both a testament to our success and a potential threat to everything we were trying to build. "What did you tell them?" "That we're not interested in selling, but I promised to discuss their offer with you." David's expression made clear his own feelings about the proposition. "They're offering significantly more than you paid for the bank, but they'd almost certainly close our Lakewood location and consolidate operations." The thought of Mountain View being absorbed into a corporate banking structure made my stomach tighten. We had spent months building relationships with customers and staff, implementing improvements that reflected community needs rather than corporate mandates. Selling to First National would provide financial gain but would destroy everything meaningful about our work. "Absolutely not," I said without hesitation. "We're not selling to anyone, especially not a bank that would eliminate our community presence." David smiled with obvious relief. "I was hoping you'd say that, but the other opportunities might be worth considering. Acquiring struggling community banks could extend our impact while providing growth opportunities for our staff." The idea was intriguing but also daunting. I was still learning to manage one bank effectively, and taking on additional locations would multiply both the opportunities and the challenges exponentially. But it would also allow us to preserve community banking in areas where it might otherwise disappear. "Let's schedule meetings with both institutions," I decided. "We'll evaluate their situations and see if there's a way to help that makes sense for everyone involved." As David left to arrange the meetings, I sat back in my chair and considered how dramatically my world had expanded over the past few weeks. 6 months ago, my biggest decision had been which vendor to recommend for the coffee service in the employee break room. Now I was evaluating acquisition opportunities that could affect hundreds of jobs and thousands of customers across multiple communities. The growth and responsibility was exhilarating but also overwhelming. I found myself questioning whether I was ready for the increased complexity that expansion would bring. The success at Mountain View had been built on careful attention to detail and deep understanding of local dynamics. Could those principles scale to multiple locations with different communities and challenges? My contemplation was interrupted by a knock on my door. Sarah Chen, our operations manager, entered with a smile that suggested good news about something important. "The new digital banking platform is ready for testing," she announced. The vendor completed the installation over the weekend, and were scheduled to begin staff training tomorrow morning. This represented the culmination of weeks of planning and the largest technology investment in the bank's history. The success or failure of the implementation would significantly impact our competitive position and customer satisfaction for years to come. "How confident are we about the timeline for going live?" I asked. "If testing goes smoothly, we should be able to launch the customer-facing features within 2 weeks," Sarah replied. "The mobile app will follow about a month later, once we've worked out any bugs in the web platform." The technology upgrade represented more than just operational improvement. It symbolized Mountain View's evolution from a traditional community bank to a modern institution that could compete effectively while maintaining its personal service focus. The implementation would test our ability to manage significant change without disrupting daily operations. Later that afternoon, I received an unexpected call from my grandmother's former attorney, Richard Whitman. He had been monitoring my progress with the bank and wanted to discuss some additional aspects of the inheritance that hadn't been relevant until recently. "Elisse, congratulations on the success you've achieved with Mountain View," he began. Your grandmother would be incredibly proud of how you've handled both the responsibilities and the opportunities. Thank you, Richard. I think about her guidance almost daily, especially when facing difficult decisions. That's actually why I'm calling. There's an additional component to your inheritance that becomes available once you've demonstrated successful business ownership for 6 months. His tone suggested something significant was coming. Margaret established a separate fund specifically for community development and expansion of beneficial business activities. The revelation caught me completely off guard. I thought I had understood the full scope of my grandmother's estate planning, but apparently there were additional layers of complexity and opportunity that I hadn't known about. What kind of fund? I asked, trying to process this new information. $5 million designated for acquiring and improving businesses that serve community needs, Richard explained. Banks, certainly, but also grocery stores, pharmacies, hardware stores, any business that provides essential services to underserved communities. The scope and implications of this additional inheritance were staggering. $5 million could fund multiple bank acquisitions or allow for diversification into other community-serving businesses. But it also represented an enormous increase in responsibility and complexity. The fund comes with the same philosophical requirements as your original inheritance, Richard continued. Any business you acquire must demonstrate genuine community benefit, treat employees fairly, and maintain local ownership and control. As I ended the call with Richard, my mind raced with possibilities and concerns in equal measure. The additional funding could transform my role from successful bank owner to community development catalyst, but it would also require skills and knowledge I wasn't sure I possessed. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of routine banking operations that felt surreal given the morning's revelations. As I processed loan applications and reviewed operational reports, I found myself seeing everything through the lens of potential expansion and increased responsibility. David stopped by my office as the bank was closing, noting my distracted demeanor with the perceptiveness that made him such an effective partner. "You look like someone who's had a day full of big decisions," he observed, settling into his usual chair. "Want to talk about whatever's weighing on your mind?" I shared Richard's call and the revelation about the additional inheritance fund, watching David's expression shift from surprise to excitement to concern as he processed the implications. "That's an incredible opportunity," he said finally, "but also a massive responsibility. Community development on that scale would require a completely different set of skills than bank management." His assessment matched my own concerns. While I had proven capable of learning banking operations and management, taking on multiple businesses across different industries would require either rapid expansion of my expertise or significant reliance on trusted partners and advisors. "I keep thinking about what my grandmother intended," I reflected. "She structured everything to ensure I would learn and grow gradually, building capabilities before taking on larger responsibilities. Maybe this is the next stage of that education." David nodded thoughtfully. "The timing is interesting. The calls about other banks, the media attention, and now this additional funding all coming together suggests opportunities that didn't exist 6 months ago." As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed, and how much it might change again in the coming months. The quiet bank teller who had hidden her true circumstances for 4 years had become a public figure in the local business community and now faced the possibility of becoming a significant force in community development across Colorado. The apartment that had felt too small just weeks earlier now felt like a sanctuary where I could process the day's complexities in solitude. I made tea and settled by the window, watching the evening lights begin to twinkle across Denver while considering the choices ahead. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica asking if I wanted to have dinner later in the week to catch up on everything that was happening. The simple gesture of sisterly concern and interest felt like another gift in a day full of unexpected developments. I was no longer the underestimated younger sister whose career choices were questioned at family gatherings. Instead, I had become someone whose decisions could affect entire communities, and whose success had transformed not just my own life but the dynamics of my family relationships. The journey from dismissed bank teller to community leader had happened faster than anyone, including myself, had expected. But sitting in my apartment with the city spread out below me, I felt ready for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. Sometimes the most profound transformations happen not when we finally achieve our goals, but when we discover that our goals were smaller than our actual potential. And sometimes the greatest success isn't in proving that others underestimated us, but in discovering that we underestimated ourselves. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of our newly acquired second location in Thornton, watching the digital ribbon-cutting ceremony that would officially launch Mountain View Community Banking Group. The room was filled with local business owners, city council members, and staff from both our Lakewood and Thornton locations. David stood beside me, now serving as Chief Operating Officer for our expanded operations, while I had taken the title of President and CEO. The transformation had been remarkable. What started as one struggling community bank had become a regional network focused on preserving local banking while providing modern services. The Thornton acquisition had been completed just 3 months earlier, saving a 70-year-old institution from closure and preserving 23 jobs in the process. Mayor Patricia Rodriguez of Thornton stepped forward to offer remarks about the acquisition's impact on the community. When we learned that Thornton Community Bank was facing closure, we feared our downtown would lose a cornerstone business that had served families for 3 generations. Ms. Thompson and her team didn't just save the bank, they've reinvested in our community and created opportunities for growth we hadn't imagined possible. The mayor's words reflected the broader success of our expansion strategy. Rather than simply acquiring assets, we had focused on preserving community relationships while introducing operational improvements and modern technology. The Thornton location now offered the same digital banking services as our Lakewood branch, but maintained the personal touches that had defined its decades of community service. As the ceremony concluded and guests mingled over refreshments, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The nervous bank teller, who had been dismissed by her family less than a year ago, had become a regional business leader whose decisions affected hundreds of employees and thousands of customers across 2 communities. Jessica approached with her new fiancé, Michael, whom she had met at a professional networking event just 2 months after our family dinner revelation. Their relationship had developed quickly, built on mutual respect, and shared ambitions that seemed much healthier than her previous partnerships. "I still can't believe this is all yours," Jessica said, gesturing around the bustling branch. "When I think about how we used to worry about your career prospects, it seems insane in retrospect." Michael, a marketing director for a renewable energy company, had been fascinated by our expansion strategy since meeting me at their engagement party. "The way you've grown while maintaining community focus is exactly what sustainability experts talk about in other industries. You're proving that local ownership can compete with corporate giants." Their comments highlighted something I had been thinking about frequently as our success attracted more attention. The principles that guided our banking operations, focusing on relationships over transactions, and long-term community health over short-term profits, seem to resonate with broader cultural shifts towards supporting local businesses and sustainable practices. Dr. Amanda Foster, a professor of business ethics from the University of Colorado, had reached out the previous month about including our expansion model in a case study she was developing about conscious capitalism and community development. The academic interest in our approach suggested that what we were doing had implications beyond banking. The evening wound down with staff members from both locations gathering for informal conversations about shared challenges and opportunities. Watching loan officers from Lakewood and Thornton exchange insights about serving small businesses, or seeing our technology specialists train their new colleagues on digital platforms, I felt profound satisfaction with the culture we were building. David joined me as I was gathering my things, his expression mixing pride with exhaustion from the busy day. "Ready to head back to Lakewood?" The 40-minute drive between our 2 locations had become a regular part of my routine, splitting time between offices and ensuring that both communities received adequate attention and support. The commute also provided thinking time that had become increasingly valuable as our responsibilities grew. "I had an interesting conversation with Harold Martinez today," David said as we navigated evening traffic back toward Lakewood. "He wanted to congratulate us on the Thornton acquisition, but he also mentioned something about Westfield Community Bank. Westfield was a small institution about an hour north of Denver that had been struggling with similar challenges to those we had faced before our technology upgrades and capital improvements. Harold's mention suggested potential opportunities that aligned with my grandmother's vision for community development. "Are they looking for buyers?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Not officially, but Herald heard through banking networks that they're exploring options. Their board is concerned about remaining viable without significant investment in modernization. The possibility of a third acquisition was both exciting and daunting. Our success with Thornton had proven that our model could be replicated, but managing 3 locations would require additional management infrastructure and potentially new expertise in areas like human resources and compliance oversight. We discussed the potential opportunity during the remainder of our drive, weighing the benefits of continued expansion against the risks of growing too quickly. The conversation reminded me of similar discussions I had with my grandmother's attorney about using the Community Development Fund responsibly and strategically. By the time we reached Lakewood, I had decided to arrange a preliminary meeting with Westfield's leadership, not to commit to an acquisition, but to understand their situation and explore whether our model might provide solutions to their challenges. The Lakewood branch was quiet in the evening light, its historic facade glowing softly under the street lamps that had illuminated Main Street for decades. As I unlocked the front door to retrieve some files from my office, I felt the same sense of connection to community history that had motivated my initial investment in Mountain View. My office, now properly furnished with updated technology and comfortable seating for meetings, had become a hub for strategic planning and relationship building that extended far beyond traditional banking services. The walls displayed framed articles about our expansion, photographs from community events, and a beautiful painting of the Rocky Mountains that had been a gift from the Thornton Chamber of Commerce. A stack of mail on my desk included invitations to speak at 3 different business conferences, a request for consultation from a credit union in Wyoming, and a personal note from Mrs. Patterson expressing gratitude for our support during her grandson's college application process. The variety of correspondence reflected how dramatically my role had expanded beyond day-to-day banking operations. The personal note from Mrs. Patterson was particularly meaningful because it represented the human impact of our success. Her grandson had received a scholarship to Colorado State University, and our financial literacy workshops had helped the family navigate the complex world of student loans and college financing. These individual success stories motivated me more than any business accolades or expansion opportunities. As I organized my desk and prepared for the next day's meetings, my phone rang with a call from my parents. They had become regular supporters of our community events and frequently attended ribbon cuttings, financial seminars, and other public functions where they could express pride in my accomplishments. "Elisse, we just saw the news coverage of today's ceremony," my mother said warmly. "The mayor's comments about community impact were wonderful. Your father and I are so proud of what you've built." The transformation in my parents' understanding and support had been one of the unexpected gifts of revealing my true circumstances. Where once they had offered well-meaning but misguided career advice, they now sought my insights about business strategy and community development. "We were wondering if you'd like to have dinner this weekend," my father added, having picked up another phone. "Uncle Steve is visiting from Phoenix, and he's been telling everyone about your success. He wants to hear about your expansion plans directly from you." The dinner invitation represented another milestone in our family relationships. Instead of gatherings where my career was discussed as a problem to be solved, these events had become opportunities to share achievements and seek advice about future challenges. After ending the call with my parents, I spent several minutes reviewing the financial reports that David had prepared for the Thornton acquisition. The numbers told a story of successful transformation: loan portfolio growth of 23%, customer acquisition exceeding projections by 15%, and operational efficiency improvements that had reduced costs while improving service quality. But beyond the financial metrics, I felt most proud of the qualitative changes we had achieved. The Thornton staff, who had been demoralized by months of uncertainty about their bank's future, had embraced our community-focused approach with enthusiasm. Customers who had been considering switching to larger banks had renewed their loyalty based on improved services and continued personal relationships. The success formula we had developed seemed to be replicable. Combine modern technology with traditional community banking values, invest in staff development and customer relationships, and maintain local ownership and decision-making authority. This approach addressed the fundamental challenge facing community banks across rural America. As I locked up the bank and headed home, I reflected on how my definition of success had evolved over the past year. Initially, my goals had been modest: prove my competence, gain family respect, and build a sustainable business. Now I found myself thinking about regional impact, industry leadership, and the possibility of creating a model that other communities could adapt. The drive home took me through neighborhoods where many of our customers lived, past businesses that had benefited from our commercial lending programs, and through the downtown area that had been revitalized partly through our support of local development initiatives. The visible signs of community prosperity felt more meaningful than personal financial success. My apartment had been transformed as well, upgraded to a larger space in a renovated warehouse building that provided both comfortable living quarters and a home office where I could work on strategic planning during evenings and weekends. The industrial aesthetic suited my personality while providing space for the entertaining and networking that had become part of my professional responsibilities. Jessica called as I was preparing a late dinner, her voice bubbling with excitement about wedding planning and career developments that reflected her own growth over the past year. "Michael thinks we should ask you to speak at his company's leadership retreat," she said. "They're looking for examples of sustainable business practices, and your expansion model fits perfectly with their environmental and social responsibility goals." The request reflected how far our relationship had come since the family dinner where she had dismissed my career as meaningless. Now she was actively promoting my expertise and seeking opportunities for me to share insights with her professional network. "I'd be honored," I replied, meaning it completely. Community banking and environmental sustainability have more in common than people usually realize. We talked for nearly an hour about wedding plans, business developments, and family dynamics that continued to evolve as everyone adjusted to my transformed circumstances. Jessica's genuine pride in my achievements had replaced the condescending concern that had characterized her attitude for years. As I prepared for bed that evening, I thought about the young woman who had walked into Mountain View Community Bank 4 years earlier, desperate for any job that would pay rent, while she figured out her true direction. The path from that nervous applicant to regional business leader had been anything but linear, requiring patience, strategic thinking, and the courage to pursue long-term goals despite short-term criticism. The secret inheritance that had enabled my acquisition of Mountain View had been revealed to be just the beginning of my grandmother's vision for community development. The additional funds she had designated for expanding beneficial businesses represented opportunities I was only beginning to explore fully. But the greatest transformation hadn't been financial or professional. It had been personal. The approval and validation I had once sought desperately from family and society had become less important as I discovered the satisfaction of building something meaningful regardless of external recognition. The girl who had hidden her true circumstances to avoid complicated explanations had become a woman comfortable with public leadership and media attention. The sister who had endured dismissive comments at family gatherings was now the family member others turned to for business advice and strategic insights. Looking back on the family dinner where everything changed, I realized that the dramatic revelation of my bank ownership had been less important than the quiet confidence I had built through years of dedicated work and strategic planning. The shock on my family's faces when David introduced me as the new owner had been satisfying, but it paled in comparison to the daily satisfaction of running successful businesses that served their communities effectively. Sometimes the most powerful victories aren't the moments when others finally recognize your worth, but the gradual realization that their recognition was never necessary for your success. And sometimes the greatest accomplishment isn't proving that people underestimated you, but discovering that you had underestimated yourself all along. The minimum wage job that my sister had mocked had become the foundation for a regional business empire built on community service and sustainable growth. The quiet bank teller who had seemed to lack ambition had been secretly preparing for opportunities that exceeded everyone's expectations, including her own. As Denver settled into peaceful sleep around me, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point, and excitement for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The story of the underestimated young woman had evolved into something much larger, a testament to the power of patient planning, community focus, and the courage to build something meaningful while others question your choices. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.